Forget the old school books. Forget the statues. Forget the simplified narrative that tells you the American Civil War was just about states' rights. The truth is darker, more complex, and fundamentally modern than you can possibly imagine. In 1861, America was not one nation divided, but two radically different economies colliding in a storm of iron, fire, and moral reckoning. On one side, a booming industrial giant fueled by railroads, telegraphs, and a massive workforce. On the other, a proud, brittle empire, King Cotton, whose dependence on 3.5 million enslaved people made its collapse inevitable. This is not just a story of Gettysburg. This is the story of the economic crucible. We're not just talking generals. We're going deep into the untold conflicts, the high-stakes naval duel of the Ironclads that rendered every wooden warship in the world obsolete overnight, the chaos of Confederate hyperinflation, where poor white women were literally rioting for bread in the streets of the capital, Richmond, declaring they wouldn't fight for the rich man's Negro, the secret lives of hundreds of women who cut their hair, donned male uniforms, and fought on the front lines for both North and South, and the transformative heroism of 180,000 black soldiers who, in the words of Frederick Douglass, were earning the right to citizenship with every musket they raised. The war ended at Appomattox, but its final battle, the battle for American equality, is still being waged today. We will show you how the 14th Amendment, born from this very conflict, remains the foundation for almost every major civil rights decision in modern history, shaping your life, your freedoms, and your government. If you want to understand the deep, unbreakable roots of modern American power and struggle, you have to understand this war. Hit that like button, subscribe so you don't miss our deep historical dives, and let's unlock the true story of the U.S. Civil War, the economic crucible, and the birth of a modern nation. The U.S. Civil War, 1861 to 1865. The economic crucible, a moral challenge, and the birth of a modern nation. The prologue. Two nations, inevitable conflict, and the myth of states' rights. The conflict that erupted in April 1861 was more than a civil war. It was the inevitable climax of a profound structural and moral schism simmering since the Republic's founding. By the mid-19th century, the United States was fractured into two distinct societies. The North was a dynamic, industrializing, and commercial region, founded on free labor and a growing belief that ambitious white farmers and laborers had a birthright to Western territories untainted by slavery. The South, conversely, remained predominantly agrarian, locked into a plantation system. Historians often compare this system to the factory system applied to agriculture, depending entirely on enslaved labor. This dependency made the South immensely rich yet fundamentally fragile. King Cotton accounted for up to 60% of all American exports by 1860. The Southern elite had convinced themselves that this lifestyle and prosperity were inextricably linked to the enslavement of African people. Deconstructing the central myth. The widely propagated narrative, particularly championed by the lost cause ideology, that the war was fought purely over states' rights, is historically unsustainable. Analysis of primary documents and secessionist declarations reveals that the war ignited over the irreconcilable conflict concerning the status of slavery in new territories. Southern states did not secede to defend an abstract autonomy, but to protect their right to expand and perpetuate slavery. Southern politicians even claimed, paradoxically, that slavery was intrinsically tied to democracy, asserting that by excluding black people from the political sphere, slavery acted as a leveling principle that was friendly to equality among white citizens. The election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860, a member of the anti-slavery Republican Party, served as the direct catalyst for the secession of 11 Southern states. In his first inaugural address in March 1861, Lincoln squarely placed the responsibility for the impending conflict on the rebellious states, stating, "There needs to be no bloodshed or violence, and there shall be none, unless it be forced upon the national authority. In your hands, my dissatisfied countrymen, and not in mine, is the momentous issue of civil war. 2. A war of innovation and the genius of leadership. The Clash of Presidents. Lincoln versus Davis. The face-off between the Union and Confederate presidents, Abraham Lincoln and Jefferson Davis, seemed a battle between the self-made man and the professional. Davis was a West Point graduate, a war hero, and an experienced military man. Lincoln, a self-taught lawyer from Illinois, appeared ill-suited for the role of commander-in-chief, initially making mistakes, such as entrusting command to the ineffective General George McClellan. Yet it was Lincoln who demonstrated the capacity for strategic growth, ultimately recognizing that saving the Union required a radical moral and military step: emancipation. While Lincoln successfully mobilized the North's industrial might, Davis, despite his military credentials, failed to outmaneuver his opponent and structure the weak Southern economy for a protracted war of attrition. Technology, logistics, and asymmetrical resources. The Civil War was the first truly modern industrial war, and its outcome was largely predetermined by the Union's logistical and technological superiority. The Confederacy, whose political philosophy prioritized states' autonomy over strong central government and whose economy was tied to slave labor agriculture, lacked the capacity and desire to create the centralized financial and industrial system required for a long war. The North, by contrast, could scale up production and logistics rapidly. Rail and telegraph transportation technology played a decisive role. Railroads, which General William T. Sherman deemed critically important, allowed for the rapid movement of troops and supplies at speeds never before seen. The North possessed an integrated rail network, unlike the South's disparate short lines, which often had different track gauges, making efficient transport catastrophically ineffective. The telegraph, working in tandem with the railroads, provided unprecedented speed in communication between Washington and the front lines, allowing leaders to react and take action much faster. The Ironclad Revolution naval warfare was fundamentally changed overnight. In March 1862, the Battle of Hampton Roads saw the clash of ironclads, the Confederate CSS Virginia and the Union USS Monitor. Though the battle was a tactical draw, the strategic consequence was global. It proved that wooden warships were instantly obsolete, rendering every nation's fleet essentially useless. The Union's ability to quickly adapt the Monitor's design and order 56 additional Monitors underscored its industrial might. The critical turning point, July 1863. While the war contained many pivotal moments, July 1863 is routinely cited as the ultimate point of no return for the Confederacy, delivering two decisive blows. Gettysburg, July 1st to 3rd. General Robert E. Lee's last major attempt to invade the North was repulsed. This strategic Union victory shattered the Confederacy's final hope for a military solution to the conflict. Vicksburg, July 4th. The fall of Vicksburg, Mississippi secured full Union control over the Mississippi River, slicing the Confederacy in two and opening the door to further Western campaigns. The untold horror of Gettysburg. The Second Battle of Gettysburg, seldom commemorated, was the fight for survival waged immediately after the combat ceased. The small village, home to just 2,500 citizens, was suddenly inundated with 36,000 desperately wounded soldiers. Surgeons, utterly overwhelmed, were forced to grimly separate the injured into two groups, those likely to die and those with a chance of survival. Scores of men in the first group were carried to nearby woods and laid in rows, where they moaned and twitched painfully while waiting alone for the end. A Union surgeon later observed that Gettysburg was an occasion of the greatest amount of human suffering known to this nation since its birth. The Western campaign's true-weight crucial events continued to unfold in the West. In November 1863, the Battle of Chattanooga, Tennessee, featured one of the war's most dramatic acts, a spontaneous Union infantry charge that carried Missionary Ridge, a position widely viewed as impregnable. Military historian J.F.C. Fuller argued that Grant's victory at Chattanooga was the true turning point, as it opened the path for General William T. Sherman's destructive campaigns into Georgia, to Atlanta, and the subsequent march to the sea, which crippled the Confederacy's heartland. Third, hidden rifts, the Confederacy's internal collapse. The South was defeated not only by external pressure, but by an internal economic and social collapse that belied the myth of its monolithic unity. Hyperinflation, class conflict, and the Bread Riots. The Confederacy's core problem was uncontrolled financial ruin. The government printed approximately $2.25 billion in unsecured paper money, leading to runaway hyperinflation that exceeded 9,000%. As the financial system failed and the railroad network crumbled due to lack of repair and sabotage, food shortages in urban areas became catastrophic. This crisis exposed deep-class fissures. The wealthy, slave-owning elite frequently shifted the burden of war onto poor white farmers, seizing supplies while speculators hoarded essential goods, fighting for the rich man's Negro. The starkest evidence of this internal dissent were the Bread Riots, the largest of which occurred in the Confederate capital, Richmond, on April 2, 1863. Starving women, whose husbands were away fighting, stormed commercial establishments, demanding food. Letters show that poor Southern whites complained their sons and husbands were fighting for the big man's Negro, demonstrating the profound resentment that the war primarily served the interests of the slaveholding class. The Richmond elite, attempting to deny these social cracks, refused to show empathy, instead blaming the riots on outsiders and social outcasts. The failure of cotton diplomacy. The Confederacy staked its foreign policy on cotton diplomacy, believing that dependence on Southern cotton would force Great Britain and France to recognize and intervene on the Confederate side. This calculation proved profoundly mistaken. No major power ever formally recognized the Confederacy. While effective Union diplomacy played a role, the fundamental failure lay in the South's inability to account for the moral factor. By the 1860s, moral considerations in Europe, where slavery had long been abolished, outweighed economic need. The Confederacy, founded upon an institution that some historians have called our American Holocaust, could not gain legitimacy from developed nations, sealing its diplomatic failure. 4. A new birth of freedom. Heroes and revolutionaries. The Emancipation Proclamation. Abraham Lincoln had long sought a constitutional and political mechanism to end slavery, which he viewed as a moral wrong. On January 1, 1863, he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, a strategic move declared as a military necessity that freed enslaved people only in those states in rebellion against the Union. This decision became a critical turning point because it officially made emancipation a war aim of the North, transforming the war for Union preservation into a war for a new birth of freedom, a phrase Lincoln would later use at Gettysburg. The proclamation immediately solidified Union support among anti-slavery European nations, finally extinguishing the Confederacy's hopes for official recognition and intervention. Furthermore, it encouraged thousands of enslaved people to escape, weakening the South's labor force and bolstering the North's ranks. The U.S. Colored Troops, USCT. Following the proclamation, recruitment into the regiments of the U.S. Colored Troops USCT began in earnest. By the war's end, over 180,000 African Americans, including more than 94,000 former slaves, served in the Union Army, making up 10% of its total strength. Despite facing pervasive racial prejudice, lower pay, and heightened dangers, the Confederacy refused to recognize them as lawful combatants. These soldiers proved their valor repeatedly. They fought bravely at engagements such as Port Hudson, Fort Wagner, and New Market Heights. Sergeant William Harvey Carney of the 54th Massachusetts became the first African American to receive the Medal of Honor. Their participation was a direct demand for civil rights. As the great abolitionist Frederick Douglass asserted in 1863, "Once let the black man get upon his person the brass letters U.S., let him get an eagle on his button and a musket on his shoulder, and bullets in his pocket, and there is no power on the earth or under the earth which can deny that he has earned the right of citizenship in the United States." The unseen heroes, women on the front and home front. The Civil War shattered traditional Victorian notions of femininity, demanding unprecedented public and battlefield participation from women, black and white. Secret soldiers and spies. While accurate numbers are impossible due to the clandestine nature of the activity, conservative estimates suggest that between 400 and 750 women disguised themselves as men and served in the armies of both sides. Figures such as Albert Cashier, born Jenny Hodgers of the 95th Illinois Infantry, participated in over 40 engagements. Sarah Emma Edmonds, who served as Franklin Flint Thompson of the 2nd Michigan Infantry, served as a nurse and spy, and later became the only woman to receive a veteran's pension for her service. Others, like Loretta Janetta Velazquez, served the Confederacy as both a soldier and a spy, even employing a fake mustache. On the home front and near the battlefield, women assumed critical roles that paved the way for future social change. Harriet Tubman served the Union as a spy, scout, and nurse. Clara Barton, the most famous nurse of the Civil War, later founded the American Red Cross. Thousands of women working with the U.S. Sanitary Commission, USSC, gained invaluable organizational and political experience, described as the Union's other army, which they later leveraged for the women's rights movement. The legacy from 1865 to modern America. The Civil War preserved the Union and triggered a constitutional revolution that permanently reshaped the balance of federal and state power. The Constitutional Revolution. The 3 Reconstruction Amendments provided the legal foundation for modern U.S. citizenship. The 13th Amendment, 1865, formally abolished slavery throughout the United States. The 14th Amendment, 1868, established African Americans as full U.S. citizens, overturning the notorious Dred Scott v. Sanford, 1857, decision. Crucially, this amendment radically expanded federal power over the states to guarantee equal protection under the law for all citizens. The 15th Amendment, 1870, granted African American men the right to vote. The invisible legal legacy. The 14th Amendment is not merely a historical footnote. It is the legal bedrock of modern American jurisprudence. Its equal protection and due process clauses are among the most heavily litigated parts of the Constitution. This amendment has served as the basis for landmark Supreme Court decisions shaping contemporary life, including Roe v. Wade, 1973, and Bush v. Gore, 2000, proving that the legislative work of the Civil War continues to govern the nation's destiny. Unfinished justice and the link to 1965. Despite the revolution of the Reconstruction Amendments, the period is widely viewed as having ultimately failed. By the late 19th century, the promise of equality was undermined by Jim Crow laws and racial discriminatory practices, establishing segregation and a second-class status for African Americans. The Civil War's impact on modernity is undeniable, as the fight to realize the full promise of the 14th and 15th Amendments continued for another century. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s, culminating in the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, was a direct continuation of this unfinished revolution. These modern laws explicitly leaned on the constitutional changes wrought by the Civil War to finally dismantle legalized segregation. Conclusion. The American Civil War, 1861 to 1865, was a conflict that, although initiated to protect the institution of slavery, was transformed by Lincoln into a crusade for freedom. The Union victory was secured not only by military strategy, but by overwhelming industrial supremacy and the moral necessity of emancipation. Analysis confirms that the Confederacy's internal structure, its hypertrophied dependence on agrarian slave labor, and its inability to centralize resources amid hyperinflation and class strife, made defeat inevitable, irrespective of tactical victories. The heroism of its invisible participants, the USCT soldiers who earned the right to citizenship with a musket, and the women soldiers who defied rigid gender norms, underscores that this was a struggle to redefine the very essence of American citizenship. The legacy of this war endures in the Constitution, providing the legal framework for the ongoing struggle for equality that continued a full century after Appomattox. Click on the like button and subscribe so you don't miss our deep historical dives. Also, leave your opinion about everything that happened in this story. Write time codes of the highlights.